The auctioneer's chant was a hypnotic rhythm under the relentless August sun of 1973. It was the sound of a man's life being sold off, piece by piece, Frank Miller's farm. Frank was a good man, a hard worker, but his heart had given out in the middle of planting season, leaving his wife with a mountain of debt and no way to climb it. His son, Richard, stood near the front, not in mourning, but with the predatory stillness of a hawk watching a field mouse. He wasn't here to save his father's legacy, he was here to witness its transformation into his own. I stood near the back, leaning against the rusty fender of my '68 Ford pickup, the heat radiating through my jeans. My name is Jedediah Stone, and I was 24 years old. The farm my grandfather had carved out of the Iowa prairie was mine now, a modest 240 acres of black dirt that I worked with his machines. A 1951 Farmall M for the heavy tillage, and a John Deere 4020 I'd bought with 3 years of saved cash. They were old, they were paid for, and they were mine. Richard Miller, or Rich as he insisted everyone call him, was the opposite. He was the new breed. He saw debt not as a chain, but as a rocket. He'd already leveraged his own small inheritance to buy a brand new John Deere 4630, the kind with the air-conditioned sound guard cab and a tape deck. He farmed with a checkbook, not a wrench. He was talking loud enough for half the county to hear, pontificating to a circle of nodding acolytes about expansion, about getting big or getting out. The key is cash flow and asset leverage, he said, gesturing with a soft, uncalloused hand. You take what the bank gives you, buy the best and the biggest, and let the production pay the note. Old Frank, bless his heart, he tried to do it all with cash. You can't grow that way. You get left behind. A few older farmers shuffled their feet, their faces grim. They remembered the Depression. They knew what a banknote felt like wrapped around your throat. But the younger guys, they were mesmerized. Rich was painting a picture of a future where farming wasn't about sweat and grease, but about management and finance. The auctioneer moved past the household goods and the smaller tools, his voice rising in pitch as he got to the iron. The tractors went first, a decent Oliver 1850 and an old Case 930. They brought good money. The grain trucks, the planter, the disc, all sold for more than they were worth. Commodity prices were through the roof. Wheat was over $5 a bushel, corn was pushing $3. Everyone felt rich, and they were spending like it. Then they dragged it out from behind the barn. A collective groan went through the crowd. It was a monster, a Massey Harris Super 92 combine circa 1958. It was one of the last big conventional machines before the rotaries took over, a behemoth of faded red paint and rust. It hadn't run in years. One of the huge rear tires was flat, the rubber cracked and split like an old boot. A thick curtain of vines clung to the unloading auger, and a family of starlings flew out of the grain tank as the tow truck yanked it into the open. "All right, boys, what am I bid for this piece of agricultural history?" The auctioneer bellowed, a smirk playing on his lips. "She's a fixer-upper, a real diamond in the rough. Who'll start me at $500? $500 for the pride of the Massey Harris line." Silence. A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Rich Miller laughed out loud. "More like a boat anchor," he shouted. "You ought to pay someone to haul it away for scrap." The auctioneer, flustered, tried again. "400? 3. Come on now, the engine's worth that in scrap iron. Give me $200. More silence. The thing was a joke. It was too big, too old, and too broken. Parts were impossible to find. The engine, a massive Chrysler Flathead 6, was likely seized solid. It would take $1,000 in tires alone just to make it roll right. My mind wasn't on the crowd, though. It was on my own combine, a John Deere 45 pull type that I ran with the Farmall. It was slow, it was small, and it was a bottleneck. I could only harvest about 10 acres on a good day. A self-propelled machine, even an old one, would double my speed. It would mean getting the crop in before the fall rains, before the snow. It meant survival. I thought of my grandfather. "Pay cash or don't buy it, Jed," he'd told me 100 times. "A debt is a promise you make to a stranger. A promise to give him your land if you fail." This machine was scrap, but scrap is cheap. $50, I said. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the murmuring like a razor. Every head turned to look at me. Rich Miller's smirk widened into a full-blown grin of disbelief. $50, the auctioneer boomed, his eyes lighting up. He'd found a sucker. I've got 50, now who'll give me 60? $60, 60. The crowd was dead silent, staring at me like I'd grown a second head. $50 once. Rich stepped forward. Son, are you feeling all right? That thing's a money pit. The engine's probably got a rod through the block. $50 twice. I just looked at the auctioneer and gave a slight nod. I knew what I was doing. Or at least I hoped I did. Sold, the auctioneer cried, slamming his hand down, for $50 to the young Mr. Stone. A wave of laughter and pitying shakes of the head washed over the crowd. I felt my face burn, but I kept my composure. I walked to the clerk's table, pulled a worn leather wallet from my back pocket, and counted out 2 20s and a 10. The paper felt crisp in my hand. It was my money, earned and paid. As I was signing the receipt, Rich Miller sauntered over, clapping me on the shoulder with a patronizing thud. Jed, he said, shaking his head. I admire the spirit, I really do. But you just bought yourself 1,000 hours of misery for $50. You should have come to me. I could have co-signed a note for you at the bank. Get you into a new gleaner. Make some real money. I don't like notes, Rich, I said, folding the receipt and tucking it into my shirt pocket. You don't like progress, you mean, he countered, his voice dripping with condescension. While you're out here skinning your knuckles on that relic, I'll be buying up the section next to you. You can't win a race with a plough horse against a thoroughbred. This is the new age of farming. He walked away, back to his circle of admirers, leaving me standing there next to my $50 disaster. The sun beat down, and the smell of rust and old oil filled my nostrils. He was right, it was a mountain of misery. But it was my mountain, and it was paid for. Now, before we get into the nuts and bolts of what I was up against with that old Massey, I want to ask you all something. Have you ever taken a chance on something everyone else called junk? A car, a tool, a piece of equipment that was destined for the scrapyard, but you saw the potential in it. Tell me about it down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your stories of turning one man's trash into your own treasure. Getting that combine home was the first battle. My neighbor, Old Man Hemlock, a retired farmer who'd seen it all, agreed to help me for a case of beer. He had a big Oliver tractor with a hydraulic winch. It took us the better part of an afternoon just to get the one flat tire, hard as iron and fused to the rim, off the machine. We wrestled a used mismatched tire I'd bought at the co-op onto it, sweating and cursing in the oppressive heat. The air was thick with the smell of scorched rubber and our own frustration. Finally, with a groan of protesting metal, we winched the beast onto a lowboy trailer Hemlock had borrowed. The drive back to my farm was a slow, nerve-wracking procession. The combine was wider than the trailer, wider than the lane. We took the back roads, the gravel crunching under the immense weight. Every farmer we passed stopped their work to stare. I could see them shaking their heads, probably already composing the story they'd tell at the coffee shop the next morning. You see what that stone boy dragged home, lost his damn mind. We parked it in the grassy area behind my machine shed, the only place big enough to hold it. It listed to one side, looking even more pathetic and defeated on my own land. Hemlock stood there, wiping his brow with a greasy rag, and took a long look at the machine. Well, Jed, he said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into the dust. You wanted a project. You got one. That there is a Chrysler 331 industrial Hemi engine. Or what's left of it. Good motor in its day, but if she's seized, you're in for a world of hurt. For the next week, I did nothing but stare at it, circling it like a wolf studying a wounded moose. I pressure-washed decades of grease, bird droppings, and caked on dirt from its frame, revealing the full extent of the decay. The sheet metal was dented and torn in places. The belts were all dry-rotted, cracked like desert soil. The wiring was a chewed-up nest of brittle insulation and corrosion. I started with the engine. The dipstick was dry, coated in a black tar-like substance. Not a good sign. I pulled the spark plugs, and they were fouled with carbon and rust. I poured a little diesel fuel into each cylinder, a trick my grandfather taught me to help break a seized engine free. I let it sit for 2 days, hoping the penetrating oil would work its magic. Then came the moment of truth. I put a 4-foot breaker bar on the crankshaft bolt at the front of the engine. I leaned into it with all my weight. Nothing. It was solid as a block of granite. I put a pipe over the handle for more leverage, the steel groaning under the strain. My feet slipped in the dirt as I heaved, my back screaming in protest. A loud crack echoed in the quiet afternoon, and my heart sank. But it wasn't the engine. It was my breaker bar snapped clean in two. Rich Miller was right. It was a boat anchor. That night I sat at my kitchen table, the smell of burnt coffee thick in the air, and stared at a stack of bills. The fuel bill from spring planting, the seed bill, the property tax notice. It wasn't a huge amount of debt, not by Rich Miller's standards, but to me it was a weight. I had enough money saved to pay it all off, but it would leave me with almost nothing in reserve. That combine was supposed to be my way forward, a way to increase my efficiency without taking on a 5-figure bank loan for a new one. Now it was just a $50 monument to my own foolishness. The talk at the co-op was merciless. I'd go in for a bag of bolts and the conversations would stop. I'd catch them whispering, see the pitying looks. They called it Jed's Folly, or the Stone Monument. Rich Miller fueled the fire, of course. He'd make a point of asking me loudly how my restoration project was coming along. A smug grin plastered on his face. "You know, Jed," he said one morning, leaning against the counter while I paid for a hydraulic filter, "the bank is offering 7% interest on equipment loans." 7%. It's practically free money. You could have a new John Deere 6600 in your shed by tomorrow. "And a payment book an inch thick," I muttered. "It's called investment, Jed. You spend money to make money. You're trying to save your way to prosperity. It doesn't work like that anymore." He was winning them over. More and more farmers were showing up with new iron, financed to the hilt. The dealership in town was having its best year ever. I was the relic, the stubborn fool clinging to the past, while the future was roaring by in an air-conditioned cab. Defeated, I went back to the combine. I decided to pull the head off the engine. It was the only way to know for sure what was wrong. The cast-iron head weighed over 100 pounds. Using a chain hoist rigged to a tree branch, I carefully lifted it free. The sight underneath made my stomach clench. It was worse than I could have imagined. Water had gotten into the cylinders. The number 3 and 4 cylinders were filled with a rusty, scaly sludge. The pistons were fused to the cylinder walls, welded together by years of corrosion. It wasn't just seized, it was petrified. The engine was junk, a complete loss. I sat down hard in the dirt, the greasy head gasket lying at my feet. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant strokes of orange and purple. It was beautiful, but I couldn't appreciate it. All I could see was failure. The laughter of the auction crowd echoed in my ears. Rich Miller's smug face floated in my mind. Maybe they were all right. Maybe I was just a stubborn kid who didn't know when he was beat. I spent the next 2 weeks calling every salvage yard in a 3-state radius. The conversations were all the same. "A Chrysler 331 Industrial? Hemi?" The voice on the other end would chuckle. "Son, we ain't seen one of those in 20 years. Scrapped 'em all." Parts were non-existent. The engine was an orphan. My only option was a complete repower, which would cost thousands of dollars I didn't have. I was ready to give up, to call the scrapper and admit defeat. I'd lose my $50 and what was left of my pride. It was Old Man Hemlock who saved me. He stopped by one evening, a bottle of cheap whiskey in his hand. He found me sitting on the combine's platform, staring out over my fields of growing corn. He didn't say anything at first. He just sat down next to me, uncorked the bottle, and took a long pull. He handed it to me. The whiskey burned all the way down. "Engine's shot, ain't it?" he said, his voice raspy. I nodded, unable to speak. "Figured as much," he said. He pointed a gnarled finger toward the horizon. "See that line of trees over there? That's the old Thompson place. Went broke in '65. House is gone now, but the barn's still standing. Old Man Thompson had one of these Masseys. Bought it new in '57. He was so proud of that thing." My head snapped up. "What happened to it?" Hemlock took another drink. "Rolled it. Came down that big hill by the creek too fast, full of wet corn. Thing went over on its side, busted up the separator, bent the frame all to hell. Thompson never had the money to fix it. He just dragged it into the barn and left it there to die. Far as I know, it's still there. A flicker of hope, small but fierce, ignited in my chest. You think the engine was probably fine, Hemlock said, a slow smile spreading across his weathered face. The rest of the machine was junk, but the engine was likely pristine. Old man Thompson was meticulous about maintenance. Now his son owns that land, lives in Des Moines. Probably doesn't even know it's in there. The next morning I was on the phone. I found a number for a Robert Thompson in Des Moines. I explained who I was, what I was trying to do. He was quiet for a moment. I remember that old thing, he said. Dad was heartbroken when he wrecked it. You're telling me you want to pull the engine out of it? Yes, sir, I'll pay you for it. Pay me? He laughed, a dry, humorless sound. Son, if you can get it out of that collapsed wreck of a barn, you can have it. Just don't get yourself killed. The barn was worse than I'd imagined. The roof had caved in over the years, and the whole structure leaned at a precarious angle. But there, in the gloom, covered in a thick blanket of dust and hay, was the ghost of another Massey 92. It was twisted and broken, a sad metal carcass. But the engine, protected under the hood, looked untouched. It took Hemlock and me 3 days of dangerous back-breaking work. We had to cut away fallen beams with a chainsaw, the air thick with the dust of ages. We used hydraulic jacks to support the sagging roof while we worked. Finally, using the chain hoist, pry bars, and every curse word we knew, we wrestled the engine free. It was a greasy 800-pound heart transplant. Back in my shed, the real work began. The donor engine was in far better shape, but it hadn't run in almost a decade. I tore it down completely, laying out every nut, bolt, and piston on wooden benches. I cleaned every part in a tub of kerosene until the original cast iron shone through. I took the block and heads to a machine shop in the city to have them magnafluxed for cracks. They came back clean. I ordered a full gasket kit, new rings, new bearings. The parts had to be special ordered from a warehouse in Kansas City. While I waited, I rebuilt the carburetor, the starter, the generator. I rewired the entire machine with new heavy-gauge wire, soldering and shrink-wrapping every connection. I learned more about mechanics in those months than I had in my entire life. My hands were permanently stained with grease, my knuckles a roadmap of cuts and scrapes. By the time the harvest of 1974 rolled around, I had the donor engine reassembled and sitting in the frame of my combine. The day I first tried to start it, my hands were shaking. I'd poured my entire summer and what little money I had into this machine. Hemlock stood by with a fire extinguisher, a grim look on his face. I hit the starter button. The engine turned over slowly, groaning. Then it coughed. A puff of black smoke shot out of the straight pipe exhaust. It coughed again, then roared to life with a thunderous bellow that shook the windows of the shed. It was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. That fall, while Rich Miller was cruising across his 1,000 acres in his brand-new Gleaner N6, listening to the radio in his air-conditioned cab, I was out in my fields on the old Massey. There was no cab, just open air. The noise was deafening. Dust and chaff rained down on me, sticking to my sweat-soaked shirt. But the machine worked. It chewed through my corn and soybeans, the Chrysler Hemi humming its powerful song. I got my crop in a full 2 weeks earlier than I would have with my old pull type. My yields were good, and with the prices still high, I made a decent profit. The years that followed settled into a rhythm. The early 70s were the boom years for American agriculture. The Russian grain deal had sent prices soaring. Land values doubled, then tripled. Farmers who had been cautious their whole lives were suddenly taking on massive debt to expand, convinced the good times would never end. Rich Miller was their king. He bought another quarter section, then a full section. He traded in his 4630 for a brand-new John Deere 8630, a massive four-wheel drive articulated tractor that looked like a monster from another planet. He built a new house on a hill overlooking his expanding empire, a sprawling ranch-style home that looked out of place among the simple farmhouses of the county. He was a success story, the man who had seen the future and mortgaged it. And I was the county fool. I stuck with my 240 acres. I kept running my old paid-for iron. The Massey got me through 4 more harvests. Every winter, I'd pull it into the shed and give it a thorough overhaul, replacing bearings, patching sheet metal, keeping it alive. I didn't make the kind of money Rich did. I didn't have the flashy new equipment. The talk in the coffee shop was that I was scared, that I lacked ambition. Jed Stone is farming like it's 1950, they'd say. He's going to get left behind. What they didn't see was my ledger book. While their profits were being eaten up by huge interest payments, mine were going into my savings account. While they were signing new notes for new equipment, I was paying down the original mortgage on my farm. I lived simply. I didn't need a new truck every 2 years or a fancy house. The house my grandfather built was good enough for me. In the fall of 1978, I walked into the Farmers Trust and Savings Bank. Old Mr. Abernathy, the bank president who had known my grandfather, greeted me with a warm smile. I handed him a check. "Is this what I think it is, Jed?" he asked, his eyes twinkling behind his thick glasses. "Final payment, Mr. Abernathy," I said. "For the farm." He stamped the paperwork with a heavy, satisfying thud. "Your grandfather would be proud, son. Very proud. There aren't many young men who own their land free and clear these days." He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "You be careful, Jed. I'm seeing things I don't like. These interest rates, they're not stable. The feds are talking about tightening the money supply to fight inflation. A lot of these boys who are leveraged to the hilt, they're in for a world of hurt if these rates go up." I walked out of that bank holding the deed to my land. It was just a piece of paper, but it felt as heavy and as real as a bar of gold. I was debt-free. That very same week, the local paper ran a front-page story about Rich Miller. He had just purchased the 800-acre Henderson farm, one of the biggest in the county, taking on his largest loan to date. He was quoted in the article, standing in front of a brand-new Steiger Panther tractor. "You have to be aggressive to stay on top," he said. "In modern farming, you go big or you go home." Standing there, with my deed in my hand and the newspaper in the other, I felt a cold chill run down my spine despite the warm autumn air. I looked up at the sky. Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon. The boom was ending. A storm was coming, and I had a feeling that a lot of people were about to find out the difference between owning a farm and just making payments on one. The good years, the fat years, rolled on until they felt like the new normal. The calendar pages turned from 78 to 79, and then to 1980. The price of corn held steady, and land was still the surest investment a man could make. But Mr. Abernathy's warning echoed in the back of my mind. I watched the news. I read the papers. Inflation was a snake eating its own tail, and a man named Volcker at the Federal Reserve was talking about breaking its back, no matter the cost. The first sign of trouble wasn't in the markets, it was in the sky. The summer of 1980 was a scorcher. The sky turned a pale, hazy white for weeks on end. The rain simply stopped. The corn in my fields, which should have been shoulder-high by July, was stunted and yellowing. The leaves curled inward during the day, a desperate attempt to hold on to what little moisture they had. The ground cracked open in patterns like broken pottery. I did what I could. I cultivated the rows with the old Farmall M, trying to create a dust mulch to slow the evaporation. The work was brutal, the heat shimmering off the tractor's red hood in waves that distorted the air. Out in the fields, the silence was unnerving. No birds, no insects, just the low chug of the tractor and the dry rasp of the steel shovels slicing through the baked earth. Rich Miller's approach was different. He had installed a massive center-pivot irrigation system on his newly acquired Henderson farm. A quarter-mile-long metal skeleton that crawled in a perfect circle, drawing water from a deep well. It was a marvel of modern engineering, and it cost a fortune. But even it was struggling. The well was drawing sand, and the nozzles on the pivot kept clogging. His fields looked better than mine, a patch of defiant green in a landscape of brown, but I knew what it was costing him in electricity and maintenance just to keep it running. One afternoon, I saw his big John Deere 8630 sitting idle in the middle of a field, its hazard lights blinking lazily in the heat. A white service truck from the dealership was parked beside it. I drove my pickup down the road and pulled over. Rich was standing there with the mechanic, his arms crossed, his face a mask of frustration. "What's the trouble, Rich?" I called out. He barely glanced at me. Main hydraulic pump went out, took the whole electronic control board with it. Can you believe that? A 2-year-old tractor. The mechanic, a young kid I didn't recognize, chimed in. "Got to order the board from Moline. Be 3, maybe 4 days. The pump we can rebuild, but that board," he whistled, "that's going to be pricey." "Everything is pricey," Rich snapped, kicking at a hard clod of dirt. He was paying a man $200 an hour to tell him he'd have to wait. His planter sat idle, hitched to the tractor, in the middle of his soybean field. Every day he waited was a day lost in a shortened, drought-stricken season. I nodded. "Well, hope you get it sorted." I drove away thinking about my own tractors. My 4020 had a simple, gear-driven hydraulic pump that you could rebuild on a workbench in an afternoon. My Farmall M had a mechanical lift that ran off the PTO. Nothing electronic. Nothing I couldn't diagnose with a wrench and a wiring diagram. Rich had bought a thoroughbred, all right, but when it went lame, it had to be hauled away in a trailer by specialists. My old plough horses just kept pulling. The drought broke in August, not with gentle showers, but with a terrifying display of nature's fury. A line of thunderstorms rolled in from the west, the sky turning a bruised greenish black. The tornado sirens in town began their mournful wail. I managed to get my equipment into the shed just as the first massive hailstones began to fall. They were the size of golf balls, then baseballs, hitting the tin roof of the shed with a deafening roar like a continuous shotgun blast. The storm lasted only 20 minutes, but it was enough. When it was over, I stepped outside into a world of shredded green. My cornfields were decimated. The stalks were broken and bent, the leaves stripped to ribbons. The soybeans were pounded flat into the mud. A season's work gone. But I wasn't alone. The entire county was hit. Rich Miller's irrigated corn, the pride of his operation, was just as shredded as mine. The difference was he had hundreds of thousands of dollars in operating loans tied up in that crop. I had my seed and fuel costs, but that was it. The loss was painful, but it wouldn't break me. I wasn't sure Rich could say the same. The real hammer blow fell that winter. As if the drought and the hailstorm weren't enough, President Carter announced a grain embargo against the Soviet Union. The market, which had been the foundation of the 70s boom, vanished overnight. The price of corn plummeted from $3 a bushel to just over $2. Soybeans cratered. Suddenly, the math no longer worked. The cash flow projections that had justified those massive loans were now just fantasy. The first cracks in the empire began to show. Rich had to sell off his entire herd of feeder cattle at a loss just to make the interest payment on his land loan. The brand new Steiger Panther tractor he'd paraded in the newspaper sat in his shed. He couldn't afford the fuel to run it. He started driving his old pickup again, the one with the dented fender, instead of the new one he'd bought his wife. The confidence was gone from his eyes, replaced by a haunted, hunted look I was starting to see on the faces of farmers all over the county. The storm Mr. Abernathy had predicted was no longer on the horizon. We were in the heart of it. The early 1980s descended upon us like a plague. The Federal Reserve, in its crusade against inflation, pushed the prime interest rate to an astronomical 21%. It was a number that seemed impossible, a death sentence written in cold, hard figures. Every farmer with a variable rate loan, which was nearly everyone who had expanded in the last decade, was trapped. Their monthly payments doubled, then tripled. At the exact same time, their income was cut in half. The coffee shop, once a place of boisterous talk about expansion and new equipment, fell quiet. The conversations were now whispered, furtive discussions about loan restructuring, about which neighbor was rumored to be selling out, about the foreclosure notice tacked to the courthouse door. The bank, once a partner in prosperity, became the enemy. Mr. Abernathy was forced into retirement, replaced by a cold-eyed man from a corporate office in Des Moines who spoke only in terms of assets and liabilities. Farm auctions became a weekly, then a daily occurrence. They were grim affairs, nothing like the optimistic auction where I had bought my combine. Here the faces were gaunt, the mood funereal. Families stood by silently, watching as their lives were dismantled piece by piece, the auctioneers chant a rhythmic eulogy for their dreams. Rich Miller's name came up more and more. He was selling off parcels of land, the newer pieces he'd acquired, trying to shrink his debt and stay afloat. But it was like trying to bail out a sinking ship with a teacup. Land values were collapsing as quickly as crop prices. The very asset that was his collateral was evaporating. I survived by retreating. I hunkered down, my farm a debt-free island in a sea of red ink. My operating costs were the lowest in the county. While others were paying 20% interest on their fuel and seed loans, I paid with cash from my savings. I didn't make much money, but I wasn't losing it either. My old machines became my salvation. The Massey Combine, Jed's Folly, was now my most valuable asset. While brand-new combines sat in sheds, too expensive to repair, when a complex hydrostat transmission failed, my old Massey kept running. I could overhaul the simple gear-driven transmission myself. I could get parts from a tractor salvage yard, or in a pinch, make them myself with my welder and lathe. My neighbors, the same men who had smirked at my $50 purchase, started stopping by. Not to mock, but to ask for help. "Jed, my old case won't start. I think the carburetor's shot. The dealer wants $600 for a new one." I can't," one of them told me, his eyes pleading. I'd go over with my toolbox and a can of carburetor cleaner. More often than not, it was just a clogged jet or a stuck float. A half hour of work, and the old tractor would sputter back to life. I never asked for money. They'd pay me in other ways. A few bales of hay for my small herd of cows, a side of beef for my freezer, help fixing a fence. We were going back to an older way of doing things, a system of barter and community that had been forgotten in the boom years. We were surviving. The end for Rich Miller came in the spring of 1983. The bank called his notes, all of them. His last-ditch efforts to sell land had failed. There were simply no buyers. The foreclosure was swift and brutal. The auction was set for a cold, windy day in early April. I went. I had to. I parked my old Ford at the end of a long line of dusty pickups and walked up the gravel lane to the house he had built, the one on the hill. The yard was filled with people, but there was no chatter, only the sad whistling of the wind through the bare branches of the oak trees. The auctioneer stood on a flatbed trailer, his voice lacking its usual boisterous energy. He sounded like an undertaker. They sold the household goods first, then the tools from the shop, gleaming sets of wrenches and sockets that looked like they had barely been used. Then came the iron. The monstrous John Deere 8630, the symbol of his ambition, sold for less than a third of what he'd paid for it. The new Steiger Panther went for scrap value. Planters, discs, grain trucks, a multi-million-dollar fleet of the best equipment money could buy, all sold for pennies on the dollar to opportunistic buyers from out of state. Rich stood near the house, his wife beside him, her face pale and drawn. He was a ghost at his own funeral, his eyes blank, watching his empire turn to dust. He looked aged, his shoulders slumped in a suit that now seemed too big for him. He had lost everything, the land, the house, the machines. All that was left was the crushing weight of a debt he would likely never be able to repay. He hadn't just gone home, he had been sent there in ruin. I didn't bid on anything. I was just there to witness the final terrible turning of the wheel. As the crowd began to disperse, I saw the auctioneer move toward the last and most significant item, the land itself. They were selling the original Miller home quarter, the 160 acres that had been his father's, the farm where he had grown up. My heart pounded in my chest. I thought of my own farm, of the deed sitting in my safe deposit box. I thought of my grandfather's words about debt being a promise to a stranger. This was it. This was the end game. I walked over to the small cluster of men gathered around the auctioneer. I was a spectator, nothing more. But then I heard the opening bid, and it was so low, so insultingly low, that a fire ignited in my gut. This land, this good black Iowa dirt that a family had worked for generations, was being treated like a disposable commodity. Before I even knew what I was doing, I raised my hand. "I'll bid," I said, my voice clear and steady in the wind. The auctioneer's head snapped in my direction, his eyes wide with surprise. The other bidders, vulture-like men in clean boots and city coats, turned to look at me, the local farmer in worn jeans and a flannel jacket. A small bidding war started, but they were speculators, looking for a quick profit. I was bidding with a different kind of currency. I was bidding with a decade of frugality, with every skinned knuckle and greasy night spent in my shed. When the auctioneer's gavel finally fell, the land was mine. I had paid cash. The auction was over. The last of the cars and trucks rumbled down the lane, leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the cold air. I stood alone in the yard, the signed purchase agreement in my hand. Then I saw Rich. He was walking toward me, his steps slow and heavy. He stopped a few feet away, not looking at me, but at the house, his house, which now stood on my land. "So," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper, "the county fool gets the last laugh." There was no triumph in me, only a deep, aching sadness. "It's not about laughing, Rich." "Isn't it?" he shot back, his eyes finally meeting mine, and they were filled with a terrible, raw pain. "You were right all along, you and your rusty junk. You tried to save your way to prosperity, and it worked. I tried to invest my way there, and here I am, homeless." I took a deep breath. "Not necessarily." He looked at me, confused. "The house is empty," I said. "The land needs to be farmed. I'll need someone to work it. Someone who knows this ground better than anyone." He stared at me, his mouth slightly agape, as the meaning of my words sank in. He was a proud man, and I was offering him a job, a chance to work as a hired hand on the very land he used to own. It was the ultimate humiliation, but it was also a lifeline. "I'll need a place for my family to live," I continued, my voice gentle. "You can stay in the house. Rent it from me. We can work out a sharecrop agreement on the land, a 50-50 split after expenses. It's a better deal than the bank ever gave you." Tears welled in his eyes, tears of shame, of anger, of a gratitude so profound it choked him. He just stood there, shaking his head, unable to speak. I didn't press him. I just nodded, turned, and walked back to my truck, leaving him to make his choice. The wind was cold, but for the first time in a long time it felt like it was at my back. The years that followed were a time of slow healing, for the land and for the people. The farm crisis left deep scars on our community. Many families left for good, their farms consolidated into larger corporate operations. But those who survived, those who held on, were different. We were leaner, tougher, and deeply skeptical of easy credit and grand promises. Rich took my offer. It was a difficult arrangement at first, full of unspoken tension and bruised pride. But as the seasons turned, a quiet respect grew between us. He was a good farmer, a brilliant agronomist when he wasn't buried under a mountain of debt. He knew the land, its moods, and its needs. I was the mechanic and the planner. I kept the old iron running, and I managed the books with a conservative hand. Together, we made that farm profitable again, even with the low prices. We were a team, forged in the crucible of failure and survival. I never became the kind of farmer Rich had once been. I never bought a brand new tractor just for the sake of it. But I did expand. As other farms came up for sale at bargain prices, I bought them, always with cash, always making sure the purchase made sense on paper, not just in ambition. By the time the 90s arrived, Stone Farms was one of the largest family-owned operations in the county. But my headquarters was still the old machine shed, and my office was still the kitchen table in my grandfather's house. The old Massey Harris combine became a legend. I eventually retired it from frontline duty, buying a newer but still used John Deere 7720 to handle the bulk of the harvest. But I could never bring myself to sell the Massey. I kept it in the back of the shed, and every fall I'd fire it up and harvest the 40 acres around my house with it. The roar of that Chrysler Hemi was a reminder, a touchstone to the past. It was the sound of my $50 bet paying off. It was the sound of my independence. I have a son now. His name is Samuel, and he has my grandfather's eyes. He's not a big kid, but his hands are strong, and he has a curious mind. He loves the machine shed more than any other place on earth. The other day, I found him out by the old Massey, running his hand over the faded red paint. "Dad," he asked, "is it true you bought this for only $50? It's true, I said, squatting down beside him. And you fixed that big engine all by yourself? Well, I had some help from old man Hemlock, I admitted. But yeah, we got her running. He looked from the massive combine to the rows of other machines in the shed. Tractors and planters and trucks, all of them used, all of them paid for. Rich Miller's son told me at school that his dad used to own all this, he said, his voice quiet. I put my arm around his shoulder. He did. He owned this and a whole lot more. He was a good farmer, Sam. He just made a promise to a stranger that he couldn't keep. My son looked up at me, his expression serious. What promise? I looked out the big shed door, across the fields that stretched to the horizon, land that was truly, completely mine. The sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows. I could smell the rich black dirt, the promise of another season. The promise, I said, pulling my son a little closer, that tomorrow will always be better than today. I pointed to the combine. That machine taught me something different. It taught me that you don't bet on tomorrow. You build it piece by piece with your own 2 hands.